how does it feel to be a player for the United States? And you look up in the box for your first game of the World Cup. There's Gianni Infantino. There's Donald Trump. There's the guy who wants your parents gone. How do you do that? I am stunned, frankly, that we haven't had people come out and say, I'm not playing for the United States this summer. But I remind myself that I am not someone who has spent his whole life trying to reach that stage. So it make it very difficult to put down the jersey and walk away. But can you speak up? Yeah.
Well, we haven't talked much on this podcast about specific teams, but I think that there's one team that we should talk about because it feels directly relevant to everything we've been talking about on this podcast, which is Team USA, the US men's national team, USMNT, as they call it. The US team is one that it used to be fun to root for, I think, because they used to be such a scrappy underdog. I have memories of USA beating Portugal in 2002 and coming out of a group in 2014 with Germany and Portugal and Ghana. I think it was fun to root for them because it was one of the few things that I suppose that the US are not dominant at. It's funny to think of Americans as underdogs in anything, really. But that gets so cloudy in the political moment we're in. People will tell you that sports and politics don't mix and not to confuse them. But as we've been talking about in this podcast, everything has been political about this World Cup. Now the fact that the US at the current time, under current leadership, is no underdog in the world. I mean, it is the very opposite. It is the force of power. Many people will say the aggressor. Of course, there's a president who has verbally attacked many, many countries around the world, including allies. And then, of course, militarily attacked other countries, including participants like Iran. So to me, in 2026, when America is hosting nonetheless, I think it's very hard to still treat the US national team as we might have done before. Is that fair? I don't know. And that's kind of the question I was trying to get to the bottom of in this episode. Political decisions have nothing to do with the men on the field. But in other sports, in the past year, we've seen politics really infuse themselves into the sport. So, for example, when the men's hockey team won gold at the Winter Olympics, we saw Kash Patel, chugging beers in the locker room with the team. During the US World Baseball Classic a few weeks ago, you had one of the Navy SEAL team that captured bin Laden giving the halftime talk in the locker room. American sports in general have always been infused with this militaristic, ultra-patriotic vibe. At the NFL, there's military fighter jets doing their red, white, and blue shows every season. It's also America's 250th birthday coming up during the World Cup. Special 4th of July game in Philadelphia for that. And remains to be seen what happens with that. I mean, it's fair to say it puts a sour taste in people's mouths around the world. And I don't think the US will be high on many supporters' lists of who to root for around the world once their teams go out. Especially if Donald Trump is going to make himself, like at the Club World Cup, very much part of the US identity at the World Cup. That's why a lot of people on social media were celebrating when Venezuela eventually beat the US in the World Baseball Classic, because it was seen as the powerless winning against the powerful, just weeks after Nicolas Maduro had been captured. Soccer is especially interesting because it has such a history of immigration and is the immigrant sport in America. At the same time, you're having ICE raids and travel bans and visa restrictions. So will the US be able to shake this image of the country as a whole? Should they have to deal with that? Is it their fault? Is it their problem? Should they be speaking out more, as the US women's national team did quite a bit more over social and political issues? I got into this sort of philosophical question with Bo Duré, who is a journalist and writer across American sports. He writes quite regularly for The Guardian, has written for Forbes and USA Today and ESPN, and he's the author of the book Why the US Men Will Never Win the World Cup. That was a proclamation he made a few years ago. With that, here's my chat with Bo Duré. Bo, thanks so much for coming on the show. Do you mind just kind of introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about the work that you do?
Well, I'm obviously famous for being the best U14 center back in Athens, Georgia, circa 1983. Since then, I wrote a bunch of books. I was at USA Today for a long time. Then I wrote History of Major League Soccer called Long Range Goals. Wrote a few other books. The first season of the Washington Spirit, followed them around. Wrote a book on youth soccer. Wrote a book on soccer websites. Getting a little bit in the weeds there. And then the one that is probably most interest today, which is Why the U.S. Men Will Never Win the World Cup.
Yeah, it's such an interesting, attention-grabbing title, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about that later. But I guess the main thing that I wanted to talk about today was an article you wrote about a year ago for The Guardian, pretty much exactly a year ago, actually. The title was "The U.S. Men's National Team Aren't Just Underachievers, They're Unlikable." And it's something I've been thinking about as well this year, just with everything going on in the world, too much to list. But I guess a year on, and I want to get into some of the details, but a year on from that, where are you with that thesis?
I think it still applies. I think, for one thing, they deserve a bit of sympathy because they didn't ask to be playing a World Cup at the most divided time the USA has been since we literally fought a civil war. And so no matter where any of them stand politically, no matter where any of us stand politically, anything is going to be under a microscope. So whether it's a little dance move, oh, was that a dance move that Trump supporters like? Or, oh, he said Black Lives Matter. Well, that means that he believes in violence in cities and so forth. I mean, there's virtually nothing you can do in the United States. Or like I could walk and hop on my left foot outside and someone would say it's some sort of political movement. It's that's how politically charged it is in the United States right now. But on top of that, where are the personalities? I mean, in 1994, it was Alexi Lawless, big red beard, big red hair, played guitar and so forth. Tony Meola always seemed to have, attitude, but in a friendly way. And it was a group that I thought kind of worked its way into the public consciousness. And they were scrappy as underdogs, for one thing. I mean, no one expected them to beat Colombia. You play that game 10 times, they probably lose it 8 times, but they pulled it off that day because Colombia had one of the best players in the world at that point, Carlos Valderrama. And of course, they had an own goal that was tragic because of what happened to the defender who the ball went off of. But it was also, they played well. It was not a fluke. I mean, their second goal was tremendous. Perfectly weighted pass, Ernie Stewart with the finish. For another thing, they're not in the U.S. these days. Most of them are overseas. And so if you talk to the hardcore soccer audience, they'll say, well, here's how Pulisic is doing this year. Here's how McKennie's doing this year. You talk to most people and it's just like, where do you watch these games? Because I mean, they're not even in England for the most part. They're in Italy or Germany in places where, yes, you can get those games in the US TV, but that's often a subscription fee. It's often not someplace you can find it. Whereas, the Premier League's everywhere. I teach in elementary schools. The Premier League is everywhere. There are kids wearing Man U, Arsenal. I don't see many Man City. I'm not really sure why. Maybe because people don't like them. So so this team, they're not here. Most of them are not in Major League Soccer. In 1994, there was a national team that actually was on TV all the time because that's the only soccer there was. They were literally employed by the federation, most of them. So they're less visible, and I just don't see any unique character. Who makes fun ads out of this group? I haven't seen any. Whereas the U.S. women's team made hilarious ads all the time. They were great. If you ask someone, who saw the soccer for a long time, to say, I will have 2 fillings. It's a reference to an ad where Brandy Chastain gets 2 fillings and Mia Hamm stands up, I will have 2 fillings. And, Roy History stands up, I will have 2 fillings, just as a sign of solidarity. Where's that for the U.S.? I don't see it at all.
Yeah, I grew up in England, and I always enjoyed watching the US because, like you said, they were a sort of scrappy underdog, and it was really fun to see them like in 2002 beat Portugal, or in 2014, like Tim Howard had his incredible kind of Secretary of
Right.
Defense moment against Belgium. But even then, it was hard to convince fellow Europeans that they should root for the US, right? They were sort of, they're not very good, and now the political stuff is seeping in a lot. I know you said that it's not kind of fair on them, but can you see from the world's point of view, why should we root for this team that represents, a lot of things that are wrong at this moment in time?
And even if we weren't so politically divided, even if we had the most charismatic leader among European leaders, if we had someone who had very good relationships with Germany and France and the UK, then we're still the big bullies. And we're huge. It's a gigantic country with 330 million people, I believe, or somewhere in that range. And our culture is spread everywhere. How many Starbucks do you have near you? How many? I went to England recently and saw a Five Guys. Five Guys. Yeah. That was a burger chain that started, I'm based in Northern Virginia. It started out about 10 miles from where I live. And, 20 years ago, that's all there was. Now it's in London. I actually saw an Olympic ceremony once that was all U.S. music. Here's Madonna, here's Prince, here's I don't know, REO Speedwagon. Okay, that might be a little bit obscure, but we're everywhere. We're unavoidable. I mean, how many movies have you seen in the past 10 years? How many of them were made in the United States? I mean, so there's naturally going to be a backlash. There's naturally going to be a bit of resistance to that, and so really, if Americans had any common sense, we would be on our very, very best behavior to try to ameliorate that situation. But we're not. We're big bullies. We're demanding. I mean, there are stereotypes of, ugly Americans being tourists and, being mad that their hotel rooms are too small or something like that. They didn't have enough space to play racquetball in them or something like that. Yeah, it's a difficult thing to pull off. It can be done. And the example I think of is the 1995 Copa America. The U.S. played with a fair amount of panache and made a great run through the tournament. Top of my head, I believe they beat Argentina. They were winning over fans. I mean, people were curious. There were stories about people just kind of like staring at the U.S. as they got on the bus. And it's like, hey, it's those guys. So it can be done. And every once in a while, you have a U.S. player who made some big impression overseas. The one that you might know best, Brian McBride, played at Fulham for many years. And Brian McBride is someone who I wrote a story about him years and years ago about basically how his face has been reconstructed because he gets in the mix and suffered a lot of injuries over the years. In fact, when he was playing in Columbus, there were women would come down from the stands and say, Brian, I also had work done where you had your work done. And so just one of those guys, he's all hustle, fearless, smiling, fun. And I believe they named a pub after him for a while, but they lost it in renovation. But so it can be done. You can have the scrappy American go over and win some fans. Every once in a while, even the skilled American. I mean, I'm sure Tim Howard is fondly remembered. I would imagine that Brad Friedel had his day. Going way back, John Hart's had his day. If you have a player who's humble and works hard and fights for the team, that's a great thing about soccer fans. If you do that, they don't care where you're from.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that, humility is a big part of it, because that's not something, in my opinion, that we're seeing right now, especially when you have people like, I got to mention it. You mentioned Alexi Lalas, right? He is not a humble guy. I mean, this is a guy who, I don't know, on Instagram, he's saying Pulisic is better than Mbappe and Harry Kane. And, why do you think that Fox is keeping someone like that? If they want to change the game in the US and really change the impression of the US team around the world, are they going about it the wrong way with having kind of ultra patriotic personalities like that? Or do they think that that's the key to it?
Well, I've known Alexi for many years. I talked with him for my first book. So I talked with him several times when he was in Major League Soccer. So I've known him for, at least 20 years. Right now, when I see him on TV, he's playing a character. That's not who he is if you just talk with him in real life. He's not as blustery. And every once in a while, his bluster pays off. In the memorable speech when US was struggling in World Cup qualifying, and he just had launched a blistering tirade against the team, said, he made a reference. I didn't realize this was a reference first. Apparently, his Bruce Dickinson solo album to tattooed millionaires. These guys who were just not getting it done on the field. And that's kind of fun. His Instagram, I think, gets a little bit weirdly political at times.
He's clearly
he claims
pro-Trump.
to be,
He said that, right? Like he's a MAGA guy.
has he, or has he just, he's had pictures. He had pictures of himself taken at the Republican National Convention, but then he had pictures of himself taken at the Democratic National Convention. I think he may have voted for him, but I don't think that he would. I doubt that he would have the same view on immigration. Because look at who he played with for so many years. You have Fernando Clavillo and Tab Ramos and all those people who, without those people, we don't know who you are, Letzi, because they're the ones who got you to where you were in the '94 World Cup.
Yeah.
And I think deep down Alexi realizes that. I think Alexi found about 10 years ago that it's fun to play the provocateur, and it's probably financially rewarding for him. And so Fox is an interesting entity because, of course, there's Fox News Channel, which is pro-Trump until it becomes absurd, and then they have to push back a little bit, but they certainly make excuses for him, and to the point of having, in some cases, spread things they know were not true. But it's also the network that has The Simpsons.
Yeah.
And I wrote for Fox Sports, disclaimer alert, years and years ago when they had more writers on their site. And yeah, there's no political push for that. Fox Sports does a fantastic job with the National Football League. The broadcast quality of those games is fantastic, and you don't really catch on to the no patriotic overtones in that. So yeah, the studio crew, but they like to have studio crews who banter, and they found that people watch. It's the same reason on ESPN. ESPN has a guy who actually worked at some newspapers I worked at, is not fondly remembered, Stephen A. Smith. If you talk with people who worked with him in North Carolina, they would say, this dude never got the job done. He just did. But he just talks and yells and screams, and ESPN can't stop promoting him, even though I can't stand listening to him. Somebody must be. So yeah, that's perhaps an unfortunate comment on our viewing audience, but Saturday Night Live is fun to point out. UK television has some trash too. They had a memorable parody of Love Island a few years ago.
Oh yeah, we certainly do. I guess what's rubbing the people the wrong way and is lately, and I think you've written about this, is Kash Patel being in the dressing room for the hockey players, and then with the baseball classic, you had like the Bin Laden guy doing the halftime speech, right? This like ultra patriotic thing that would be laughed out of the room in Europe. I mean, is the US just going about this the wrong way if they want to grow the sport?
Well, I doubt they're thinking about it in those terms, and perhaps they should. And I think you raised something that maybe people at U.S. Soccer need to be cognizant of. But of course, it's one of those things where wrapping up some form of patriotism in sports, we made such a big deal of the national anthem. There was a huge, huge moment a few months after September 11th, after the September 11th attacks in 2001. The next Super Bowl, Whitney Houston went out and sang this most incredible version of the national anthem. People just thought it was great. And nobody cares that she was lip syncing, which she was. And nobody cares. And I have friends who would call themselves conservative, even by U.S. standards, which, by UK standards, the Conservative Party would be placed squarely to the left of even the Republican Party before Trump. They'd be placed to the left of George Bush or Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
But a friend who is conservative by U.S. standards and would have voted for Bush and Romney and so forth. And he pointed out that when he watched, we send fighter jets flying over stadiums for big events. And he pointed out that if we were to watch this from Iran or Iraq or even in China, we would say, oh my goodness, that's so horrible. But we're just so used to it here, so ingrained. And so what would you do if you were running U.S. Soccer? Would you stop doing that? Because then you've taken the position of now you're taking away the national anthem, or you're taking away the fighter jet flyovers. So
those two things aren't the same, right? Like doing the national anthem is not the same as having fighter jets and all these kinds of things.
Sure. I mean, everybody seems to, and sometimes soccer players are judged on whether or not they're singing along with the anthem. That has come up in the U.S. before, where there have been people who they're not being anti-patriotic. They're just zoning out. They're just in their own minds. They're thinking, oh my goodness, I have to mark Mbappe now, or I have to, or my goodness, we're going up against Italy. How are we going to break down that defense? That's probably running through their minds more than, Fort McHenry and surviving the battle and using an English drinking song to come up with the national anthem. That's very difficult to sing, but they are scrutinized on that. Oh my goodness, if a player isn't singing the national anthem, there will be backlash. So in a sense, in terms of growing the sport, well, again, we're polarized. So who are you growing it to? And that's part of my book, is that, we are diverse, which is good, but fractious, which is bad. And that is what holds us back to some extent, because it's not just in political Democrat versus Republican, Trump versus non-Trump, anything like that. It goes down to youth soccer and having many organizations and just like, no, we think we know better. No, we think we know better. And they're not unified. And then you have two clubs that have great players that are 5 miles apart and they never play each other because they're in different leagues. That's how fractious we are.
It's a really good point what you said about having to go at players for not singing the national anthem. And it's made me think like England's kind of the opposite. It's like, if you sing, it's like, get over yourself, man. You're out of tune, But like,
I didn't know that. Yeah.
But like, you're right that there is a lot of pressure on players to do or say the right thing. I mean, you talked earlier about personalities. How much does kind of activism come into personalities? I mean, should players be speaking out against some of the stuff going on, especially because immigration is so key to the story of soccer in America? The women's team, a lot of them have spoken out against these kinds of things. And you mentioned, Pulisic doing the Trump dance. I mean, should they be thinking more about their kind of image?
Yes, they absolutely should. Because in terms of growing the game, I mean, okay, so let's say you alienate people who hate Black Lives Matter, which there are people it's very tortured logic, because just like there are people who hate Antifa. Antifa is anti-fascist. And there's not an organization for that, even though Pam Bondi, who stepped down as Attorney General, said, yeah, we busted Antifa. What does that mean? It's like saying you've busted left-handed people or something like that. Or you've busted, or even worse than that, you busted the people who are against fascism. I thought we fought wars for that. I mean, I think back to storming Omaha Beach. People say, oh, you're defending our country. We weren't defending our country when we stormed Omaha Beach. We were fighting fascism. And we've forgotten that. Because I think, one factor is, in the old days, 20, 30 years ago, U.S. soccer players went to college. I saw Tony Meola play in college against my team. I went to Duke. He was at Virginia. I saw Tony Meola play in college. Duke scored 2 goals against him. I was very proud of him. And in college, you might be better educated. You might be exposed to more things. You might bump into more diverse crowds, and you might meet people who have a global perspective. And some of these people, I mean, what kind of education did Christian Pulisic get? I mean, guy's been groomed to be a soccer player since he was probably in diapers. So what he do? There's a great memoir written by the great U.S. women's forward, Abby Wambach. It's the best of the women's national team memoirs that I've read. And she openly admits that she didn't try in school. It's like, oh, I got a C on my paper. Who cares? I've got a scholarship to Florida. And I'm just going to go ahead and do, and, I don't have to worry about grades to get in. And she regrets that now. So it's a combination of people just maybe not being that well educated, just not having the perspective. You would think that living overseas will give you some perspective. You would think that having teammates who have immigrant parents who are in danger of being sent away, that would resonate with us. How does it feel to be a player for the United States, and you look up in the box for your first game of the World Cup, there's Gianni Infantino, there's Donald Trump, there's the guy who wants your parents gone. How do you do that? I am stunned, frankly, that we haven't had people come out and say, I'm not playing for the United States this summer. I'm not going to do it. But I remind myself that I am not someone who has spent his whole life trying to reach that stage. So it'd make it very difficult to put down the jersey and walk away. But can you speak up? Yeah. And I can't believe some of these players aren't. I mean, in that, I think, is to their detriment. I think it's a clear majority in this country that does not support what's going on. I mean, if you look at poll numbers, Trump himself isn't doing very well. His numbers of immigration are horrible. There's very little support for these people who are going into cities and just rounding people up. There are people who have seen their neighbors taken away. There are people who supported Trump and they themselves have been taken away. And so I think the risk of a Pulisic or a Yunus Musa or a McKinney or whoever ends up in the goalkeeper for the U.S., which used to be the U.S. strength and is not anymore. I mean, we had Miola, Keller, Friedel, Howard, and not so much since then. But why these people aren't speaking up about their teammates' parents, I don't understand that at all.
No, it's a great point. I suppose we should talk about what's going on the pitch, because part of the story has always been, with the US being an underdog, but maybe one day they can make it past the quarterfinals. Or, how do you see the state of the team right now under Pochettino? Are you optimistic? How are you feeling?
To some extent, I don't care. Because, well, there's one more thing I'll get back to about the team and their likability factor. But in terms of playing, the previous teams had fire, or they had panache. One big reason that the U.S. made it to the quarterfinals in 2002 was that they had Landon Donovan and DeMarcus Beasley, players who had excelled at youth level just a couple of years earlier. And they were, in many senses, too young to be scared. They perhaps didn't dwell on the significance of what they were doing as much as an older player might be. Or in some cases, you take someone who's 30 years old is getting their first and probably only shot at the World Cup. The nerves there are going to be different than if you're 18 and this is your first chance and you're really excited and you're not really as nervous. And also, I think they had a lot to prove to, in some cases, hey, I'm good enough to play in the Premier League. If you're Brian McBride, I'm good enough to play in the Premier League. And you people in England don't realize that yet. Watch this. Watch what I'm going to do now. And then sure enough, he goes and has a fantastic career in England. Now, these kids are all in Germany when they're 17. Or there are so many, there are people that are on the fringe of the national team you've never heard of who are playing for, teams that are in the top half of their table in France or Germany. I've never heard of this person. Well, part because they never play in the U.S., unless you happen to be watching the, U16 Penn Fusion versus Loudoun game. So we don't know any of these players. And that's where Alexi comes in with the tattooed millionaires thing, is that you have people who, in a sense, I don't blame them. I mean, why would national team play to some extent matter more than club play? I mean, in club play, you're fighting for riches that could set you up for the rest of your life. You're playing with teammates you see every week. They're not players that, we called in these 24 people this week. Oh, these 6, not so good. Let's bring in 6 different ones. So I don't know that they have that fire in them. And on the flip side, sometimes they might be overawed by the occasion. I think that's what happened in the U.S. ill-fated qualifying campaign in 2017. I think they just sort of froze up, got scared by what was going on. So I think the skill was there. It's the mentality, it's the belief, it's in some cases the humility. I mean, you have to walk such a fine line when you're an athlete between humility and confidence. You have to know that you have the capability to get it done, and you have to get it right to get it done.
Yeah, it's really hard to predict because they seem to be it seems to be extremes. Sometimes they'll go and beat Uruguay 5-1 and then they'll get thrashed 4-0 or whatever it was, right? It's just one of those that's really hard to predict. Do you have a prediction though how far they'll go?
They'll get out of the group and go out right after that.
There's an extra round now as well, right? The round of 32,
right.
Which is
right. Yeah, I think they can make the round of 32.
Yeah.
The typical trajectory seems to be getting out of the group and then losing in the round of 16, which they've done a couple of times in the last, dating back to 1994. They've done that several times. There have been a couple of times they haven't gotten out of the group at all. One time they made the quarterfinals. Everything else they've stalled out in the round of 16. I think this year they certainly won't get past the round of 16. They might stall out in the round of 32. And that's going to depend. World Cup draws are funny animals. No matter where you're seated, you could end up playing, we're playing Tunisia in the round of 32, or, we're playing France. And you can't control that.
No.
So to some extent, to say how far they're going to go really depends on just, who ends up ahead of them.
Yeah, I think we're going to see some shockers in that round of 32 this time. It's going to be, yeah. I know it's really hard to kind of condense your book into a couple of talking points, but your book, The US Men Will Never Win the World Cup. Do you still stand by that thesis? And is it mostly to do with the pay-to-play system? Is that the biggest hurdle?
I don't think the pay-to-play system is as big a hurdle as people might make it out to be. It is certainly a hurdle. To me, the most unfair thing about pay-to-play is not from the top down, but from the ground up. I think it's unfortunate when, I mean, and I've seen it, kids who their parents can't afford it. And I've had people who say to me, well, we always have scholarships. They can always make it to do this. And I say, okay, you can pay their fees. Who's going to get them to your practices? Because you might have two parents. I mean, this is something people don't seem to realize. Immigrants work hard. They might have multiple jobs, or you may have a household where one person is, doing construction till the late afternoon. One person is, working in a hospital, and they can't get their kid to a practice at this nicely manicured field that's 20 miles away at 5:30 in the afternoon. So there's surely some talented players lost in that, but I don't think that's the number one issue. I think a big part of it is, first of all, the U.S. fell way behind. And that wasn't always the case. I mean, the 1930s, well, in the 1930 World Cup, the U.S. reached the semifinal. Now, granted, there were only 13 teams that entered, but if you were to make a inventory of talented players in the world at that time, the U.S. had a significant number of them. They were pretty good. And then for business reasons, their league fell apart. And post-war, the U.S. team went about a decade and change without winning a game. And they weren't playing that many games. So you look at where the U.S. would have been in 1965, way, way behind. And then you look at it when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't cool to be a soccer fan. Today it is. Today I'm sure I see kids, kids will come up to me. They know I'm interested in soccer. They go Messi or Ronaldo. And I have to explain to them that it's Messi. And sometimes they get angry about that. So I'm not just saying that because he plays in the U.S., although it is great to have him here.
But you're right. It is cool. Yeah. It is cool, right? Everyone's wearing the jerseys and stuff. Too,
yeah.
Right. Like, yeah.
It is. Yeah. We care, but also then again, we start caring too much. And the story often tells that there's a big coaches convention every year. And it's more than a coaches convention. It's an equipment salesman convention. It's a journalist convention. Everyone descends on wherever the city is that's hosting it. There was a session being led by some people from the German Federation. It was a packed room, a large auditorium. And someone asked him, what's the biggest difference between the U.S. and Germany in terms of youth soccer? He said, well, in the U.S., you have all these different organizations that are trying to run things. In Germany, he holds up one finger. And for the most part, that seems to work better than having this chaotic system where, for one thing, U.S. youth soccer players travel all the time. It's called travel soccer. And sometimes the travel is more than the soccer. You might have a team fly from Utah to California, go lose 10-0 and get back on the plane. And you don't get anything from that game. And also, one thing I'm fond of saying also is that you don't learn much about soccer on an airplane. It's not where you're going to develop skills. That time that was spent flying to go somewhere else or driving 10 hours could have been spending 2 hours playing soccer and 8 hours being a kid. And we don't do that. That's to our shame.
Obviously, the flying time is going to be a big thing this summer as well, right? Like a lot of teams just spending time in the air.
There are going to be some worn out players. The final is probably going to be a matter of just who's still standing.
Yeah, I think that'll be a big deal.
Yeah, it's going to be a terrible World Cup. It really is. I mean, there's no getting around it. I mean, the U.S. performance in it is only part of it. It's going to be people are sick of Infantino. The ticket prices are outrageous. They're causing a lot of backlash. And with all this travel, the teams that are coming in, I would say foreign teams, but obviously 47 of the team, well, there are 3 hosts of the World Cup this year, so 45 of the teams are foreign. They're not going to like it here. They're not going to like getting in planes everywhere. It's ridiculous. Of course, the U.S. will get in a plane anyway. I was covering the Women's World Cup one year, and the U.S. was telling me, oh, yeah, we're catching our flight from Frankfurt to Wolfsburg or whatever. I'm like, why are you flying from Frankfurt to Wolfsburg? And I was in a train station one day, and people started holding out ropes to keep people back. I'm like, oh, what's going on? The German women's national team walked right past me. They'd taken the train. The U.S. would, oh no, we're too good for that. And the thing that I was going to mention about the U.S., last thing, their likability, they had to dispute over equal pay between the U.S. women and the U.S. men. They came up with a good solution, which was to pile all the bonus money that each team wins and divide it between the two. And that was a really neat, elegant solution to the whole problem. The issue is that they take, I believe it's now 80% of the winnings. There are teams that where the players get 30%, maybe 50% of the bonus money that they win for the World Cup and other tournaments. The US were like 80 or 90. And there was already a big backlash before this agreement was signed among grassroots organizers in the U.S., the state youth associations, the state amateur associations. They almost voted out the president, who was actually really good, because they felt that she was putting too much emphasis on the national teams and not the grassroots level. On the conference call where they announced their deal, I asked, okay, this is for men's representatives, women's representatives, whoever wants to take it. There's been this backlash from grassroots organizers. What are you going to do now that this deal is signed to build that bridge back? I could have gotten vague platitudes. I could have gotten one constructive thing they want to do. I got dead silence. They didn't answer. They didn't even give an insincere platitude to say, oh yeah, we want to work with you, soccer. No, they didn't say that. They don't care.
Well, my last question, I think you kind of answered, which was just going to be, is this World Cup still an opportunity to put a spotlight on US soccer and the opportunity it could be in the eyes of the world, or is it doomed? Is it going to be a missed opportunity?
The eyes of the world, I think it's going to be pretty bad. The one thing I'd have to say to be more optimistic about it is somewhere there's a 6-year-old kid who's going to watch, Germany play Argentina or something like that, and they're going to be inspired. And that might make them more motivated to be a good soccer player, or if they can't be a good soccer player, to be a good soccer supporter, which that's the big story in the U.S. is how much supporter culture has grown up. There is support. It may be teetering a little bit because of some of the issues we've talked about. But again, it's cool to be a soccer fan, and a 6-year-old watching Germany and Argentina may think it's even cooler. So there will be that benefit. I think it's going to be outweighed by a lot of other stuff.
Yeah, that seems to be the story. Well,
Mm-hmm.
Bo, thanks so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.